There's a way to keep food fresh for weeks, and in some cases even months, without using a refrigerator, without electricity, and without any kind of modern preservation system. What makes it strange is that this method isn't new at all. It's older than refrigeration itself, built on nothing more than water, airflow, and a material most people would completely overlook. But this is where it starts to matter more than it seems. Because if your refrigerator stopped working today, most of your food would be gone within a day or two. Milk would sour, vegetables would soften, and everything you assumed was stable would begin collapsing faster than expected. This system wouldn't collapse like that. It would keep working quietly and steadily, without needing anything from you except a small amount of water. And once you understand how it works, the way we preserve food today starts to look less like a necessity and more like a dependency. The method itself is surprisingly simple. It uses two clay pots, one placed inside the other, with a thin layer of sand packed between them and water poured into that sand. There are no wires, no moving parts, and no switches, just a passive structure that doesn't look like it should do much at all. But within minutes of setting it up, something invisible begins to happen. The outer surface of the clay absorbs water, and because clay is porous, that water slowly moves outward toward the surface. As it reaches the outer wall, it begins to evaporate into the surrounding air. And this is where the system quietly starts working. Evaporation does something most people never think about. It removes heat. Every time water turns into vapor, it pulls energy with it. And that energy comes from the surface of the pot and everything inside it. This process doesn't happen in bursts but continuously, as long as there is water and airflow. Instead of forcing cold air like a refrigerator, the system slowly drains heat away, lowering the internal temperature just enough to change how food behaves. Vegetables that would normally last only a few days begin lasting a week or longer. Their moisture stays intact, and their structure doesn't collapse as quickly. The environment inside the pot becomes stable in a way that most people don't expect. But cooling alone doesn't explain everything, because lowering temperature can delay, yet it doesn't explain how some foods extend far beyond that into weeks and sometimes even months. That means something deeper is happening, and to understand it, you have to look at why food actually spoils in the first place. Food doesn't decay randomly. It breaks down because of three forces working together: heat, oxygen, and microbial activity. Bacteria grow, enzymes break down, structure, and moisture escapes. And the warmer the environment becomes, the faster all of this happens. Modern refrigeration focuses almost entirely on temperature, lowering it to slow everything down, and for the most part, that works. But refrigeration doesn't stop decay. It only suspends it, and the moment that suspension is interrupted, everything resumes, often faster than expected. Traditional systems approach the problem differently. Instead of trying to stop the process, they change the environment so the process behaves differently. This is where water becomes more than just a cooling tool. Under controlled conditions, water doesn't accelerate decay. It stabilizes it. In some methods, vegetables aren't stored in air at all, but placed in shallow containers of water, sometimes partially submerged and sometimes fully. At first glance, this seems like it should speed up rot, but over time, something subtle begins to form. The water doesn't remain perfectly clear, and it develops a slight cloudiness and a faint smell, which most people would assume is a sign that something has gone wrong. In reality, it's a sign that a balance is forming. Inside that water, microorganisms begin to compete with each other. Some die off while others dominate. Oxygen levels shift, and the pH changes slightly. Gradually, an environment develops where aggressive, destructive bacteria struggle to survive. Instead of rapid decay, the system moves toward controlled stability, where the food continues to change but doesn't collapse. This becomes easier to understand when you look at what happens in real terms. Leafy greens that would normally wilt in a few days can remain usable for over a week when their stems are kept hydrated. Herbs that would dry out quickly can stay fresh for 2 to 3 weeks simply by being placed in water. Root vegetables behave differently again, because carrots and radishes can remain firm for several weeks, absorbing moisture instead of losing it, which allows their structure to hold instead of shrinking. Some foods go even further. Potatoes, onions, and garlic, when stored in cool and stable environments with proper airflow, can last for months. They don't require freezing or chemical preservation because the conditions around them are stable enough to slow down the processes that lead to decay. But this is where the system reveals something most people never consider. In some cases, the food doesn't just last longer. It begins to transform. When water-based systems combine with stable temperatures and limited oxygen, slow fermentation can begin. This isn't the aggressive kind that happens quickly, but a gradual shift where sugars begin converting into acids. As acidity rises slightly, it creates a natural barrier that prevents harmful bacteria from taking over. Instead of rotting, the food stabilizes in a new state, which is how certain foods extend far beyond what most people expect. They don't stay exactly the same, but they become something more stable. This is the part that changes how you think about preservation. It isn't always about stopping change. Sometimes it's about guiding it. At this point, the obvious question is why this isn't used everywhere if it works so effectively. The answer has less to do with performance and more to do with scale. Modern food systems are built for speed and uniformity, where everything is standardized and controlled. Water-based systems don't behave that way, because they require observation and their outcomes vary depending on conditions. That makes them difficult to apply on an industrial level. Refrigeration, on the other hand, is predictable. You set the temperature and get consistent results across millions of systems, which is why it replaced older methods. Those methods weren't abandoned because they failed, but because they didn't fit the model. However, in replacing them, something important was lost. Modern systems trade resilience for convenience. They work extremely well until something goes wrong, because everything depends on continuous input. Electricity has to flow, machines have to function, and supply chains have to remain intact. When any part of that system breaks, the failure is immediate, and food doesn't slowly degrade but disappears quickly. Water-based systems don't behave like that. They don't rely on external power and don't collapse instantly. Instead, they degrade slowly, giving you time to react. And that time determines whether food becomes waste or remains usable. You can see the difference clearly in a simple scenario like a prolonged power outage. Refrigerators shut down. Freezers thaw, temperatures rise within hours, and within a day, most perishable food is compromised. In contrast, a system based on water and passive cooling continues working as long as there is water available. The internal temperature stays lower than the surrounding air, and the balance inside water-stored food doesn't collapse instantly. The system continues, slowly shifting but not breaking. Most people assume that without refrigeration, food is automatically unsafe, but that assumption comes from dependence rather than understanding. Preservation isn't about a single tool. It's about controlling multiple variables, including temperature, moisture, airflow, and biology. Refrigeration controls one of those variables very well, while water-based systems control several at once, and that balance is what creates resilience. This doesn't mean the system is perfect. Not every food will last for months, and not every environment will produce the same results. Factors like humidity, airflow, and water quality all play a role, and in controlled conditions, refrigeration is still more precise. But precision isn't the same as reliability, because precision depends on everything working perfectly, while reliability comes from systems that continue working even when things go wrong. That's why these methods are quietly returning. They're not replacing modern systems but acting as backups, alternatives, and ways to reduce dependence on a single point of failure. As systems become more centralized, they also become more vulnerable, and when something fails, it doesn't just affect one person but many. That clay pot sitting in the corner doesn't look important. It doesn't make noise or signal that it's doing anything at all, but inside it, something steady is happening. Heat is being removed, moisture is being preserved, and conditions are being controlled without constant input. And once you realize that food can last longer, sometimes far longer, without refrigeration, you begin to question something deeper. Not whether modern systems work, but whether they are the only systems worth relying on, because they're not. They never were. We simply built a world where we stopped needing to understand the alternatives until the moment something fails. And when that happens, this stops being an idea and becomes a solution. The moment you use it, even once, you begin to understand something most people never think about. Preservation was never really about machines. It was about control, and sometimes the simplest systems give you more of it than anything else.